The Differently Brained team acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we record, edit, and stream this podcast. We pay our respects to all First Nations peoples and their elders past, present, and future. We extend our respect to all First Nations cultures and recognise their ongoing connection to the lands, waterways, and communities.
Just a reminder that Differently Brained shares conversations about mental health and neurodivergence. Sometimes these topics can get a bit heavy, so please remember to check in with yourself before listening. And as always, please reach out for help if our chats have brought anything up for you. Now, on with the show. Hello, and welcome to Differently Brained, the podcast where no brain is the same. I am, as always, Lachlan Rutherford.
And I'm Jacinta Dietrich, and today we are joined by Michael Coles. Michael is 49 years old and he is autistic. Having been diagnosed 3 times, first with PDD-NOS back when he was 3, then diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome at 35, then re-diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder in 2017, he has been struggling with high levels of anxiety and stress his whole life. Late last year, he was hospitalised as a result of a lot of stress and changes being imposed on him due to a change in staff member and their non-acceptance of Michael's way of working, which previously was going well with other staff members. As a result, he needed to resign from his job, and now, through the NDIS, he is able to access therapies not previously available to him. He has also been recently diagnosed with expressive and receptive language disorder back in March as a result of this. Welcome to the show.
Morning, guys. How things are going? Thank you for inviting me on the podcast. It's actually a pleasant honour to be with you guys.
Oh.
Same to you.
Look, we don't have guests on to compliment us, but it is always nice when, they come on and say some nice things. To kick us off, your bio kind of covered it off, but can you tell us a bit more about your identity? I also have no idea what PDD-NOS is or expressive and receptive language disorder, so hit us with all the info.
Okay, all right. So I'll explain the PDD-NOS first. So basically, it stands for Post-Developmental Disorder Not Otherwise Specified. So basically, back in 1978, there was no really concrete sort of evidence of people except for like severely autistic and stuff like that. So for us who just presents and stuff like that in a certain type of way that they look sort of more normal, that's sort of like, it's not otherwise specified because Asperger's syndrome, as you probably know, wasn't officially recognized until 1994. Mm-hmm. So that was obviously sort of when I was like graduated from high school at that particular stage. Asperger's syndrome, I think back, even when I was actually diagnosed back then, it was actually sort of very demonized and stuff like that. So now we're sort of getting more acceptance of autism spectrum disorder and stuff like that and the autistic identity and stuff like that. So I've been always autistic, and sometimes, when I sort of be autistic and I present in sort of like some strange, weird way, that's what I sort of present with. Now, I do apologize about my broken sort of speech because I do have expressive language disorder, which basically sometimes I confuse things like, I sometimes, if my voice doesn't sound sort of like, doesn't make sense or is a little bit broken or that type of thing, or if I sort of express things from one sort of a different point of view without telling the context of it first, then, that's what my expressive language disorder really is. Because sometimes it's sort of, my brain sort of doesn't think securely with my mouth. So basically sort of like, it feels a bit broken. So I do apologize to the listeners in advance.
Oh, not at all. I think that's one of the lovely things about our community and about podcasts, by neurodivergent people and things like that, is that everybody speaks differently, everybody communicates differently, and I think, it's a really important thing to normalise all the different ways that we communicate kind of thing. So no apologies necessary. Our guests cannot say sorry. We do it all the time, but you guys never need to say sorry.
I'm a constant big apologizer, and I'm trying to sort of like, get away from that at the moment because I know I like to be authentically me, and that's what has happened since my meltdown and stuff like that. I need to sort of reconnect with my authentic self, which I think is sort of brings out who I am and stuff like that without sort of being criticized and stuff like that for being who I am. And I think being part of this community is so awesome because you get to meet some really lovely people and stuff like that as well.
Yeah. Actually, that kind of ties into what I want to ask you about next. your meltdown. Can you talk to us a little bit about like how that eventuated and what that felt like, and how it ended up?
Yeah, I'll give you a little bit of context prior to that. So what actually happened is, when I was actually first employed with my job, I actually got my job through a disability service provider, which I'm actually now no longer with. I've actually sort of swapped to another one. What actually occurred was basically I did actually sort of present to them what my disabilities are and stuff like that, and the reports and stuff like that from my therapist. And they sort of took that on board. We had quite a number of changes and stuff like that with my workplace as well, because basically sort of like a couple of the staff members actually left. And then another person who actually sort of they were trying to sort of make my life as accommodating as possible. But the problem was that basically the new person was external, so they didn't sort of brief them of what my disability was and how my way of working was. And also I was trying to people please, trying to sort of work in with what their sort of needs were.
Mm-hmm.
So the issue was with my people pleasing skills, or my people pleasing sort of like difficulties, I took on far too much work and stuff like that. And then what actually happened was basically sort of like, I was basically left behind and stuff like that with, some work. And a lot of people didn't sort of like, they forced me to do stuff that I wasn't really trained on. Right. So that was, and I tried to sort of like, break the barriers and try to say, this is how I particularly work and all that type of thing. And you'll probably sort of see that in episode 4 of my podcast, the Deep Dive podcast, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And I presented to them, but they basically sort of didn't take that on board. So as a result, basically my stress was also crumbling and stuff like that as the weight and stuff like that on. And also I had sort of like issues with my daughter's previous school, which basically we got discriminated for and trying to find a new school for her and stuff like that. And so all these things sort of like, went on top of my head. And I was basically sort of like, I was breathing fairly heavily. And basically what actually happened is, on that particular morning, I basically texted my wife at the particular time, basically said, I don't feel like doing this job anymore, because I was just, sick of all the stress and stuff like that was happening. So basically at 10 o'clock, I basically had enough. I basically rang 13 Health, which was basically the health information service in Queensland. Mm-hmm. And what actually happened was they called an ambulance. So basically they recommended I go to Robina Hospital, their mental health care unit, to actually quieten down my brain, sort of so forth, because my brain was basically really at a heightened state at that particular stage. Yeah, so that was sort of the crux of it, unfortunately.
Wow, that sounds just so intense to have been having all of that going on. And it sounds like you were really trying to, cope with it all, and just every time another thing slammed on top kind of thing.
Yeah, and basically sort of like, previously, basically I was seeing my psychologist and stuff like that. And at that particular time, all I was doing is basically sort of extinguishing fires, so to speak, but it didn't sort of crux on the real problem at hand, which is basically sort of like not coping with like the job too well and stuff like that, and basically sort of not having my needs met, so to speak.
I think so much mental health support, I think it is getting better a little bit, but so much of it is extinguishing fires. It's putting out the little, not the little things, but the things that pop up, rather than actually getting to the core of the situation and, building strategies or finding something that actually works for us. It's always like, no, you can do it. Just do this workaround instead, kind of thing.
Yeah, but it also, you can only sort of do it up to a particular point.
Absolutely.
And then what actually sort of happens is basically you don't have the sort of the strength to basically sort of like deal with it anymore. Yep. So it's very extremely overwhelming. I'm still looking for work at the moment that will actually suit my needs a bit better, and obviously less hours and stuff like that, because I've got to support my daughter with her sort of like disability as well. She's basically got more needs than what I have. And then sort of, we have to deal with it that way. So I'm trying to sort of keep my head above water at this stage.
Yeah.
So that's all we can really do.
I think there's a lot of ideas and settings and experiences that spring to mind when people talk about, an emergency healthcare facility and things like that. What was it like heading into Robina Hospital? How long were you there for?
Well, this just wasn't my first meltdown. So
Okay.
when I had to be hospitalised. So basically, I'll compare it between the one, I actually had one in 2016 as well, when I was seconded by one of my managers at a previous employment.
Yeah.
And basically, they told me to, well, in inverted commas, concentrate.
Oh, good.
So,
Great.
and then
Well,
they
that'll
basically
fix
sort
it.
of like, and they basically, I asked them, what do I need to do and stuff like that to improve, and they wouldn't tell me. So, basically what I did was I got very overwhelmed and then basically got taken off in an ambulance to, the first time it was in Brisbane. So basically it was the emergency room at the Royal Brisbane Hospital at the
Yeah.
time. And what actually happened was totally different to my recent visit, because basically it was just a regular emergency room. I just got put into one of the sort of like, the beds and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
They gave me some Valium and stuff like that to calm me down. Whereas like, the Robina Hospital, which I went down there late last year, the environment was so calming and reassuring, and I could, rest my brain for about, 4 to 5 hours and stuff like
Yeah.
that, and get myself sort of like reasonably back on track until I was actually sort of trying to I saw a doctor and all that type of thing. They recommended I go back to my GP for a further treatment plan at that particular stage.
Yeah. I love that we do have those spaces now that you can go to, and just in the span of that's 7, 8-ish years, the difference between, the city and, the emergency department and stuff. It's lovely to hear that it was, a calming and safe and reassuring space, because I think, when people think mental healthcare facility, I think, there is a lot of stigma attached to that and a lot of stereotypes around what you're going to find in there.
Yeah.
And so to know that, it was a safe place, a pleasant place, I guess, is really reassuring.
Yeah, well, it's a lot better now than what it was back in 2016 and stuff like that. So they sort of tried to sort of get me to calm down as much as possible, which I think it was really good.
I think as well, as you said, things back in 2016 were different to how they are now, because I think that some of those stereotypes are possibly justified, because when I had a bit of a breakdown in 2016 and almost went into a mental health facility, and I was expressly told it's not a nice place to be. It's not great. Maybe try to avoid going there if you can. So it's good to hear that things are markedly improved. What kind of things
are improving, but we do have a long way to go in
Absolutely.
terms of especially for employers. I mean, everybody who needs an accommodation should be able to sort of get one.
Yep.
And that's what I really believe in, and more employers should be actually doing.
Definitely. Yeah.
How do you think employers should be going about supporting, access needs and things like that? Is it something that should be asked in a job interview, or is that discriminatory? Is it something that once you're hired, they're just like, what do you need to do your job? What supports do you think would work?
Okay, so firstly, probably take the interview part first, because, the job applying thing is overwhelming in the first
Oh,
place.
absolutely.
Mhm.
Secondly, you've got this sort of with the interviews as well. They usually think the problem is they basically have a predefined answer. You basically don't know what it is. So you take the interview things out for the starters. And I've actually also sort of suggested to help my disability employment services provider. So thank you for actually asking that question. Secondly, before they actually start the job, work out what accommodations they need with both the actual employee and also their therapist.
Yeah.
Because I think having reading the reports and getting the correct support in there in the first place is really, really helpful. So basically, I usually do well with basically sort of plan it to the nth degree. So basically, there's no surprises. You know what to expect. The employer knows what to expect. The employee knows what to expect, and there's no surprises there. So I think that's probably the basic what they actually sort of need to do. Try and work with the employee and also their therapist as well to try and get the ideal work scenario and stuff like that in place, and work out what sort of systems or accommodation they will basically sort of need to be able to sort of do their job effectively, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know that, it comes up across the community and things like that in terms of, sharing diagnosis and identities at work. You've obviously had a bit of a bumpy ride. How do you share that information with employers and your colleagues and things like that? And how do you do it in a way that feels safe for you, given that, there is still so much stigma and difficulty?
To be absolutely honest, I still haven't worked that out yet, but because basically I'm getting my disability employment agency to be able to do that for me. So obviously sort of like, my current disability employment agency has a person on there with lived experience with autism. So I think that sort of, it's going to work in my favor. So, I mean, if I'm stuck sort of like communicating these things, I have people on my side to be able to sort of like communicate for me and to be able to do this effectively. And sometimes I just don't feel confident to actually sort of express it just on my own. I need somebody there to be able to sort of like vouch for me as well.
Yeah.
So just in case it's sort of like I forget or I get too overwhelmed or all that type of thing, because there's millions of sort of like different processes going on in my brain, and then just trying to sort of like, not think about 2 or 3 things at a time, because that sort of gets my brain overwhelmed. I like to sort of think 1 step ahead rather than sort of like 10 steps ahead.
Yeah. Speaking of difficult processes, how was it for you in applying for the NDIS?
Well, that's actually a really excellent question. So what actually happened is I wasn't actually formally on the NDIS until December last year. But what actually happened is my daughter got diagnosed with autism back in May 2023. But a couple of years before that, my daughter went to the Early Learning Centre, and what actually occurred was basically one of the heads there noticed that she struggled. So what actually happened was she referred them onto like a speech therapist, occupational therapist, that type of thing, and basically got us to apply for the EDIS. I think it was the Early Learning Intervention with NDIS. So she got on that. And then basically I was talking to her LAC, because she said she was basically asking me, why am I not on the NDIS? Because basically what's occurred is basically I got rejected from the NDIS back in 2018, because I think back then, because it was a level 1 diagnosis, I wasn't eligible. But this time, because what actually sort of happened was Amaze has got this brilliant service called Autism Peer Assist, which I know it's down in Victoria, but it's actually sort of, they put on people so they could actually sort of help them remotely. And Amanda, my wonderful peer mentor at Autism Peer Assist, actually helped me to get onto the NDIS, which thankfully it was very successful for in sort of like September last year. And then I've got my plan finalized in December. So, which is actually good, because I sort of like needed a support worker to sort of like, go to doctor's appointments and all that type of thing. And then sort of access like speech therapists, occupational therapists, and more psychology, which I definitely needed to be able to sort of like, demask and all that type of thing as well. So I think it's sort of vital to actually sort of get those services, because not a lot of people do get them, and not a lot of people know how to actually sort of get onto that. So I think it's fairly crucial that sort of like people can get that help to actually sort of go on to the NDIS, because it's very valuable and stuff like that. If they need that help, they deserve to actually get that help.
And it's valuable to have someone like yourself on a platform like this telling people about these services as well, because like you're right, not many people necessarily know about them. To have them all in the one place, hearing about them, it's a good thing.
Absolutely, yeah. I didn't, when I first started looking at potentially applying for the NDIS, I didn't know about local area coordinators and things like that. I looked at Amaze, but I didn't look into ways that they could potentially help, because I just assumed that if I didn't know kind of thing, and that there wasn't really that stuff to help. Outside of those kind of avenues, are there any hot tips or tricks you have for any of our listeners who are looking at or going through the NDIS process?
Yeah, probably Amaze Peer Assist is the Amaze sort of hotline down there. It's really good to actually sort of get that information for starters. I actually sort of rang them quite a number of times to get some information for my daughter and stuff like that. and then sort of getting information for myself. And then you sort of hear about all these things through Amaze and stuff like that, which quite frankly are definitely getting better. And I think sort of Amaze has been really sort of good in that space to be able to sort of like, help autistics through that. So the Amaze hotline and stuff like that, I think it's a 1300 308 699, I believe, is the number that you can call to actually sort of like, get some assistance and stuff like that. The only thing I probably would suggest though is basically sort of Amaze can help in terms of like, information or support. But the problem is you need that crisis support at that particular stage. I think they're working on that at the moment. I'm not overly too sure. But obviously sort of like, they need, obviously people that can be sort of have mental health care training to actually sort of get the anxiety level down and stuff like that in a crisis situation. So that's what I did mention to them and stuff like that quite a few times. I think they're working on it now. I'm not overly sure. So
no, that's, fantastic. And I love that, you're passing on that feedback and doing, that advocacy, not for yourself, but also for the community, because, that'd help so many people if it came in. I'm wondering, now that you're on the NDIS, I read in your, you shared a little bit about yourself with us before you came on the podcast. And one of the things that really resonated with me is that your wife is your primary support and my partner is my primary support. And I know that in the same way that you were talking about, you guys try and split household duties and responsibilities and things like that, but it can be hard because, different access needs and different levels and things. Has that got better with the NDIS, and how do you guys manage that in your relationship, just so that I can take that into mine?
Okay, well, what I can actually share with you is basically I'm still working on that at the moment. So what we've actually sort of discovered is basically some of the things that the support worker is able to do and able to help me with is basically what my wife was actually helping me with occasionally, like, on a sort of ad hoc basis.
Yeah.
But the issue was for her that she gets burnt out as well.
Yeah, of course.
Because she's obviously got, our children, and also sort of trying to sort of like, put in a full-time job and all that type of thing as well. So, I mean, it's been better in terms of our point of view to be able to sort of like, get the support that we actually sort of need to be able to sort of like, do different tasks and stuff like that. So I'm performing better in that way. I'm not 100% there yet, to be absolutely honest with you, but it's going in the right direction anyway. And then basically sort of getting the reports to be able to sort of like, this is what I should talk to my psychologist about, and all this I should share with my support worker, that type of thing, to be able to, have a happier life without that anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we are still struggling, but, it's not quite as bad as it once was.
Yeah, well, I can, definitely relate to the anxiety, and I end up with a lot of guilt that my partner ends up doing more than me, because in my mind, I've, grown up where I've got it really rigidly thought that, like, if you're in a team kind of thing, it's all 50-50, it's all equal kind of thing. And I'm trying to have to come to that more equity mindset of he has more energy than me. He has different capacity to me. He has more spoons. And, if he has to do different tasks or extra tasks kind of thing, then there's other ways, there's other things that I do for him, and kind of managing that mentally.
Yeah, and I'm still learning about the spoon theory and how it applies to me. So it's an ongoing process and stuff like that at the moment with my therapist at the moment. I am having a change of circumstances plan, which I'm hoping to get through in the next couple of months. So we'll see how that goes.
Very nice.
I'd like to talk about the Deep Dive podcast. I've listened to the first episode. I thought it was fantastic, and I think you're a great conversationalist and podcast host. But I want to know, what made you decide to start the podcast, and what does it mean for you to be a podcaster?
Okay, so, all right, so let me sort of preface this, because the Deep Dive podcast wasn't the original name.
Oh.
There was actually sort of a not safe for work name, which I won't mention and stuff like that, but basically it came to me sort of one Monday morning about sort of like 5-6 weeks ago. And basically sort of like, let's sort of like have a deep dive, interview different voices on their one special subject, which we basically like, we overshare and all that type of thing. So how do I sort of describe it? So basically ask questions about their one particular special subject that they want to talk about. So we've had some really good guests on. We've had Justin Brees just recently from Hidden Disabilities. So that went up, like, as we actually record the podcast. It was actually the same day that we actually sort of recorded this.
Okay.
There's also been like Stephanie Robertson, who is an OT, neuroaffirming OT. Kitty Beach, who is a Melbourne-based neurodivergent musical artist, which I thought it was very fascinating to actually sort of do. He actually contacted me through my Instagram, so that was
cool.
It was quite interesting. So it was sort of, you know, getting that neurodivergent perspective in terms of trying to sort of release music and trying to sort of, like, you know, promote their music.
Yeah,
and stuff like that.
absolutely.
So it's very fascinating as well. So I did do a podcast. I think it was about 15 years ago. It was just like random things, but then I decided to sort of take a break from podcasting. I decided to sort of like get back into it because I sort of had I've been watching like YouTube videos and stuff like that from people like Orion Kelly, for example. So I was trying to sort of get into that and to sort of share my experiences with autism, I think, which need to be told. Yeah, so I'm doing it from that basis and also trying to sort of like secure as many voices as possible to be able to present their special interest subjects. So I think it's rather good to be able to do that as well. So yeah, so that's the original feeling behind the podcast, and I'm hoping to have this going for a little while because there's a lot of voices that need to actually be heard on the podcast, which they need to, and everybody, like, you know, some people usually have their passionate subject which I like to talk about. So I'm trying to sort of, like, you know, delve into that and just, you know, trying to sort of make sure I ask questions that basically make them feel comfortable about their special subject.
And I absolutely love that because I think there's so much of, you know, neurodivergence and mental health that is, in terms of our interests and our passions and things like that, it is pathologized. It's like a tick off checkbox, like, ooh, weird, obsessed with this kind of thing. And I think it's so important because you show that, you know, in the same way that no disability, no neurodivergence is a monolith, we're not all just obsessed with trains. We're not all just, you know, that kind of thing. So breaking down the stereotypes around our interests and then also allowing people to express and info dump and discuss it in a safe space without feeling pathologized, without being like, oh, that's your hyperfixation kind of thing, and having it questioned or cringy, I guess. I think it's really important that, you know, we have podcasts like yours that allow people that space and just let people have those conversations, because I personally don't see the difference between any of my special interests or hyperfixations and, you know, family members who are obsessed with footy. Like, they're the same to me.
Exactly. It's sort of like, you know, it's their own special interests, and
Yeah.
I think it's better to sort of like express them and basically be free to sort of express yourself rather than, how to sort of state it, it's basically sort of like, you know, you've got a horrible special interest, we don't want to hear about it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so it's better to sort of like, you know, let people sort of run through with it. And I think it's sort of like, you know, it's better doing it that way rather than sort of, you know, basically trying to have that dismissed.
Yeah.
Absolutely. How do you feel running the podcast? We've recently recorded an episode that'll come out shortly or potentially just before this about our strengths and areas for improvement being neurodivergent podcasters in terms of, you know, the full range of tasks that you do, from like recording to admin and things like that. You obviously have a background in audio production. We found out embarrassingly right before we got on here with our mumbling.
Yeah. I used to work in community radio. Firstly, when I started back in 2000 with an Asper broadcaster in Brisbane. That only lasted, I think, 18 months, and I was doing radio announcing there. And I sort of saw that they sort of like, you know, doing editing for radio commercials and stuff like that. And I thought it looked rather fascinating and stuff like that. So when I went to 4AUR in 2002, basically there was a space in production, and I decided to sort of try my hand out, which worked out very well and stuff like that. It was there for about 4 years. And then sort of there was some, you know, sometimes with community radio there can be a little bit of politics involved.
Sure.
So that's why I sort of left. And then sort of I started a different station 2 years later, and then I did production there and doing OBs and all that type of thing, which I really loved. But unfortunately, you know, these office politics things came in, you know, at the end of it and stuff like that. And that's why I left and stuff. So I mean, sort of like, it was really good to sort of begin with, and then sort of, you've got certain personalities that you have to sort of deal with and all that type of thing as well. But, generally it was quite good. It was very extremely rewarding. I basically sort of got a system in relation to my editing of the podcast. So I've got, computer programs and stuff like that. So I record with my current podcast and stuff like that. We record sort of like a video and audio part of the podcast. And we publish that on YouTube, and we publish that, via the podcast apps as well. So, I've got a little bit of a system that I've got created. Like, I basically sort of write the script, ask questions, basically, and then I sort of edit it over the next couple of hours, just make sure everything's right and stuff like that. And then I publish it to the podcast platform. So it's just, I've had an experience in this area, and then trying to sort of interview people. Like, one of the state radio stations I was volunteering at, one of the shows I was basically purely interviewing people. So it was really good to actually sort of, craft my relaxing sort of style of conversation type of thing. And it was really sort of good because it's sort of, it was good to get that sort of like, buzz and stuff like that for myself. So, yes, that's why I've decided to sort of create the Deep Dive podcast, to be able to have those voices sort of heard.
I love that, yeah. And, you've obviously learnt so much, and now, you don't have to deal with the office politics and things like that. Like, it's all on your own terms. You choose your guests.
Well, it is definitely on my own terms because I do it at home, which is good. So I've got the experience to actually sort of set up a relatively, sort of good quality podcasting sort of thing where I could sort of like, I've got a 4K camera, which I record the video off, and then sort of like a professional microphone to be able to, record the sound. So, and then sort of like, we've got programs which they sort of like, it's very easy to record now compared to what it was before. So with the sort of the element of these, the recording technologies, it's so easy to record and all that type of thing as well.
For anyone who might be on the fence about starting a podcast and they're thinking about it, would you encourage them? Would you recommend they do it?
I would definitely recommend they do it. The more autistic voices there are, the better. I mean, the only sort of advice I would actually sort of suggest is, don't expect a great audience like, too soon and stuff like that, because it's a slow burn. And I don't recommend the sort of like, just put a little bit of money into it and stuff like that. But then sort of like, try and sort of like interview your friends or interview somebody that and stuff like that you could probably do and stuff like that, and get that confidence back. Also, that passion and stuff like that you like to share by yourself, that's also a really good thing as well.
All excellent tips and tricks. And yeah, something that we need to remember more often is that podcasting is a slow burn.
Yes.
Yes. And you get the audience just gradually and stuff like that over time. And
you'll have better months.
Having that sort of mindset, it's better to have no expectations about it.
Yeah.
If somebody sort of discovers it, great. And then you can get your guests from all walks of life. I usually get it via LinkedIn or, advertising through the podcast, social media and all that type of thing. So, so we've had some really good guests so far through that medium. And then sort of sometimes you have to sort of do that legwork yourself as well. Just basically sort of have a little bit of a script that you email people and saying, would you like to be in the podcast? Would you like to sort of book in a time? That type of thing. So they have booked in times, and I've had some really good interviews so far.
Oh, amazing.
Excellent.
Do you want to plug to any of our listeners if they want to come on your show?
Absolutely. So basically the website is www.deepdiveau.net. So basically there is a big guest tab on that website, and you can actually book in to be a guest yourself. Secondly, there's also our TikTok handle and our Instagram handle, both at the Deep Dive AU. So it's at the Deep Dive AU, one word. So you can go on TikTok and Instagram through there. There's also a YouTube page where you can sort of search. It's easy via the Deep Dive AU, but I'll share these sort of like the direct link through your apps as well, so you can actually share it with your listeners as well. And there's also a Patreon page, which I'm trying to sort of get friends of the show to sort of join as well. So that's sort of like, the big thing I like to sort of like, promote at the moment. So yeah, the more guests we're on, the better it is, and the more voices that we have on the podcast. So
I'm also incredibly impressed you're on TikTok because we've been too scared to do that. And so I'm very impressed that you took the TikTok dive because I have no idea what I'm doing.
Well, yeah, so I think initially, basically, when I sort of looked at TikTok, there's always sort of like, funky dances and all that type of thing as well, which I basically sort of did. And then I found an OT through TikTok who is my current OT. And then I decided she does her quirky things and stuff like that to TikTok. So I decided to sort of copy that, and it actually sort of really worked. So my first one, which is Michael Coles 3 on TikTok, I basically sort of did like, little bits and pieces and stuff like that about my autistic burnout, that type of thing. And then sort of I, started the Deep Dive AU to have some podcast plugs and stuff like that. So it was more sort of relating to the podcast. So that's how I sort of started my TikTok and stuff like that. So I started with it under a different account, and then I sort of like had the Deep Dive AU one as well. So Michael Coles 3, I still post on that. So that's probably my original one. And then sort of I have the Deep Dive from there. So
great.
Amazing.
Listeners, you've got some resources. So the final question, the question that I like to ask the most, and that is, for you, what have been the best examples of autistic representation and resources as well, aside from, your own incredible resources?
Yeah, well, Ryan Kelly does a brilliant sort of YouTube channel, Orion Kelly, that autistic guy.
Mm-hmm.
He does some really sort of like really good explanations for different sort of, experiences that autistic people have. So that's how I sort of like inspired me to actually start my podcast and do it in my own way. But there's also people like Woodshed Theory, Neurodivergent Janet. There's Mum on the Spectrum as well as another one that she does it from the States, and she's really good with that. Yeah, so basically there's different YouTube channels and stuff like that I got really inspired, and they sort of teach their own way of how they experience their lived experience, so to speak. So it was a good opportunity to sort of put my sort of hand in the ring in terms of that.
Great.
We love that.
Thank you so much, Michael, for coming on and chatting with us today about your experiences as an autistic person and also about your fantastic podcast, The Deep Dive, that everyone needs to listen to. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
It is a really good podcast. I really recommend you listen to it.
Yeah.
And tell me your thoughts as well, because I like to sort of have audience reactions and stuff like that as well. So I would welcome your feedback.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's it, right?
That's it. Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Michael.
No worries. Cheers.
Thanks so much for hanging out with us for another episode of Differently Brained. If you want to learn more about something that we talked about today, head to our show notes. If you want to hang out with us, yay, thanks! You can join our private Facebook group where we chat all things podcast, mental health, and neurodivergence in a safe and warm community. If Facebook isn't your thing, fair enough. You can find us on Instagram at Differently Brained Podcast. And while you're there, Lachlan and I would also love a follow on our personal pages too if you're in the mood. If you want to get in touch with us via email, we are differentlybrainedpodcast@gmail.com.
Differently Brained shares the opinions of individuals and does not consider your personal circumstances. Differently Brained exists purely for information purposes and should not be relied on as health or medical advice. Because no brain is the same, please consult your healthcare professional for your personal medical needs.